Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling some really big questions. I mean, what is reality, right? What about consciousness? Like, what's the
Yeah.
fundamental, the core of what it means for anything to even exist?
Yeah.
But we're not just going to, talk about philosophy. We're going to kind of like do it. We're gonna try to tackle these mysteries head on.
Yeah, exactly. Think of this like an exercise in philosophical thinking, And today we're focusing on this theory, this contemporary theory called Russellian Monism, that, well, it attempts to answer these really big questions. The sources we have, they really unpack this approach, this fascinating approach to understanding how the physical world, how science describes it, connects to our own inner experience, our own inner world.
Russellian monism.
Yeah.
That sounds pretty complex. So, like, why is this particular theory worth our time today in this deep dive?
Well, Russellian monism, it gives us this really interesting and pretty unique perspective on this age-old problem. It's the mind-body problem, right? And it says that the very basic building blocks of reality, they have this intrinsic nature, this deeper nature that goes like beyond what physics can describe, beyond those pure structural descriptions. And the really important part is that this hidden nature, it's key to understanding consciousness.
Okay, a hidden nature.
Yeah.
And this connects to consciousness. I mean,
Yeah.
this is where things get like really, really interesting. So, what exactly are we like trying to do today with this Russellian monism deep dive? What's our like mission, our philosophical mission, if you will?
So our mission is to try and understand those core ideas of Russellian monism. Why are philosophers so interested in this theory, especially when they're trying to understand consciousness, this hard problem of consciousness, and we also need to look at the challenges, right? Because every theory has those, so we're going to examine those challenges, those major challenges that it faces, and I guess ultimately we want to kind of see if this framework, if it gives us a better way to think about how our own experiences, our subjective experiences, fit into the physical universe, this universe that science described.
I mean, that sounds like a truly philosophical mission.
Mm-hmm.
So let's get started. Let's dive in. Where do we even begin with this unpacking of Russellian monism?
Well, the theory, it's kind of built on three core ideas, or you could call them theses. And the first one is, well, it's called structuralism about physics.
Structuralism about physics. Okay. So what's that all about? What's the basic idea there?
So basically, this idea says that when physics describes the world, especially at the most fundamental level, the really, really basic stuff, it's mostly concerned with the structure of reality, how things are arranged in space and time, and then of course how those things interact and change, the dynamics, the movement and change. Think about properties like mass or charge, for example. Physics gives us like these really precise equations that describe how these properties, how they behave, how they affect how objects move. But the point of structuralism is that physics doesn't actually tell us what mass or charge are, like their actual nature. So the key takeaway here is that physics describes how things interact, but not their fundamental like whatness.
So it's like physics gives us the blueprint, the relationships, how things are connected, but not like what those building blocks actually are intrinsically, right?
Yes, exactly. That's a great way to put it. It's like a blueprint. Yeah. And Bertrand Russell himself, he actually said it really well. He said, all that physics gives us is certain equations giving abstract properties of their changes. But as to what it is that changes and what it changes from and to, as to this, physics is silent.
I mean, that's a pretty bold statement. But wait, what about like shape, like the shape of a particle? Isn't that like a property of what it is, not just how it relates to other stuff?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one that philosophers have thought a lot about, and it might seem like shape, like you said, it's not relational. Like a sphere is a sphere, no matter what's around it. But Russellian monists, they make this distinction. They say there's relatively intrinsic properties and absolutely intrinsic properties. It's a distinction that goes back to like Leibniz and Kant, these big names in philosophy.
Relatively and absolutely intrinsic. Okay, so unpack that a bit for me. What's the difference?
All right, so imagine a relatively intrinsic property.
Yeah.
It's an intrinsic property, but it's actually based on like relationships with other things, extrinsic properties. So, for example, let's take a ball. A ball's spherical, right? That seems like it's a property of the ball itself, but But you can also think of it as coming from the arrangement of its parts, the spatial arrangement and how they're related. If those parts weren't arranged in that specific way, well, the ball wouldn't be spherical. Now, an absolutely intrinsic property, that's different. That's like the fundamental what it is. That doesn't depend on any external relations, any relationships with other
Okay,
things.
so even a ball's shape, which seems so, basic, so inherent to the ball, it's actually about the relationships of its parts, how they're all connected in space.
Exactly. And Russellian monists, they take this idea and apply it to other physical properties. Like Chalmers, he points out that in physics, when we talk about mass, we define it by how much it resists acceleration when a force is applied, which is, inherently relational. It's about how things relate to each other. So the argument is that physics, when it's describing stuff, it's only dealing with these extrinsic properties, these relationships, or these relatively intrinsic properties that are, grounded in those relationships. But the deeper, the absolutely intrinsic nature of reality, that's left out.
Okay, that's a really interesting way to kind of rethink what physics is actually telling us, what it's really all about. So that's the first core idea, the structuralism about physics. What's the second piece of this Russellian monist puzzle?
Right. So if physics only gives us the structure, the dynamics, the relationships, right? The second thesis comes in and says, hold on, there's got to be something more. It proposes that there are these fundamental properties that make up this structure, that actually have an intrinsic nature. And those are called quiddities, sometimes called inscrutables. And they ground those dispositions, those behaviors that, physics describes. Think of quiddities like the very essence of reality. That physics doesn't describe directly. It's the what it is behind the what it does,
Fluidities, inscrutables. These are like these hidden essences, the fundamental stuff that makes up reality, the stuff that physics just doesn't like touch.
You got it. That's exactly it. They're like the categorical basis for all those dispositions that physics measures and quantifies. Like, how the atoms in a diamond, the way they're arranged, that's what makes it so hard, right? Well, quiddities, they're like that, but at the most fundamental level. They ground those basic physical dispositions, like how opposite charges attract each other. And the term inscrutables, that highlights that we don't really know much about them. We don't have like direct knowledge of what they are. All we know is that they must exist to make the structure work, to be the foundation.
So we know they're there. They have to be there to be the ground for all this structure, but their actual nature, their like essence, it's a mystery, right?
That's the core idea. And Russellian monists argue for these quiddities because, well, if you have a view of reality that's just structure and dispositions all the way down, it's like Chalmers said, a world devoid of substance or qualities.
Yeah.
And that's not very satisfying, right? Metaphysically speaking, it just doesn't feel right. There needs to be something underlying all these relationships and behaviors.
Yeah, I can see that. It's like a world of pure function, pure doing, but no being, no underlying stuff. So we've got structuralism about physics, we've got realism about quiddities. What's the third piece, the piece that brings, consciousness into all of this?
That's where it gets really interesting. The third thesis is quidditism about consciousness. And this is like the heart of Russellian monism. This is what makes it Russellian. And it says that these quiddities, these hidden intrinsic properties that make up the physical world, they're not just, there, they're actually relevant to consciousness and specifically to phenomenal consciousness, that subjective feeling of what it's like to experience something.
Oh, I see. So like the feeling of warmth or the taste of coffee, those come from these fundamental quiddities.
Exactly. That's the idea. Now, it's important to note that there's no one agreed upon explanation within Russellian monism for exactly how these quiddities connect to consciousness. Some philosophers think that phenomenal properties, those experiences, are actually constituted by these quiddities, maybe together with those structural properties from physics. But the key point here, and what sets it apart from dualism, is that the same stuff that grounds the physical world, that's also fundamental to understanding consciousness. They're not separate, like they are in dualism.
So Russellian monism is saying that, to solve the mind-body problem, we have to look at the deepest level of reality, where the mind and body aren't actually separate.
That's the main idea. By combining those three theses, Russellian monism gives us this framework, this way of thinking about how the physical world, how science describes it, and our inner world, our experiences, how they're connected, how they're actually intertwined.
Okay, okay. I'm starting to get a clearer picture of the basic ideas.
Yeah.
But the source material mentions different types of Russellian monism. Like, what are the main, I guess, flavors, the variations?
Yeah, so the idea that quiddities are connected to consciousness, well, that opens up, different possibilities for how that connection actually works. One major branch is Russellian panpsychism. And the core idea here, which can be, kind of hard to wrap your head around, is that the quiddities themselves, they actually have some kind of experience, some basic level of phenomenal character.
Panpsychism. Okay,
Oh.
so that's the idea that like everything has consciousness, right? Even like down to the smallest particles. Like that's a pretty big pill to swallow, isn't it?
Yeah, it definitely challenges our everyday way of thinking about consciousness because in Russellian panpsychism, they're not talking about like the complex, rich consciousness that we experience. It's more like they call them microphenomenal properties, like really simple, maybe even, rudimentary experiences that are associated with the most basic, the most fundamental levels of reality, or even cosmophenomenal properties, which is like a kind of experience that's, well, it's universe-wide.
Microphenomenal. So like the particles that make up my phone, they might have this tiny bit of experience that still sounds, I don't know, a little far out.
Right. It definitely raises some big questions. And Searle, he's a philosopher who, he's famously critiqued this idea. He says a lot of people find it hard to believe that consciousness could be so widespread.
Okay.
But Russellian panpsychists, they push back. They say, look, these fundamental phenomenal properties, they could be completely different from the kind of consciousness that we experience. Like thinkers like Chalmers, Strawson, Rosenberg, they say we shouldn't just project our own idea of consciousness onto these basic levels of reality.
Okay, so my phone's not like thinking deep thoughts or anything. What about the other type of Russellian monism? You mentioned there were two main flavors.
Right. The other main one is Russellian panprotopsychism. And it's a slightly different take. It doesn't say that quiddities are phenomenal, but rather that they're proto-phenomenal.
Proto-phenomenal.
Yeah.
So not conscious themselves, but they have the potential, the possibility of becoming conscious.
You got it. That's exactly it. Chalmers, he describes these proto-phenomenal properties as like these special properties that aren't, phenomenal in themselves. There's no what it's like to have just one of these properties. But when they're organized in the right way, in the right structure, then they can come together and create phenomenal properties.
So it's like individual notes, musical notes, they're not a melody on their own, but when you put them together in the right way, you get a recognizable tune.
That's a great analogy. And panprotopsychism, it tries to avoid that idea of, consciousness everywhere. It's saying that consciousness only emerges in those systems where these proto-phenomenal properties are, organized in a very specific way, a way that actually generates consciousness, like in certain structures in the brain. And then, there's also these hybrid theories that combine elements of both phenomenal and proto-phenomenal quiddities.
That's interesting. So the main difference is whether those quiddities, those fundamental quiddities, whether they have a basic level of experience or if they're more like, pre-experiential properties that have to combine in a special way to make experience. Now, the source material, it also mentions like connections to more traditional philosophical views, right? Like how does this all fit in with, the other big ideas in philosophy?
Right. So one of the interesting things about Russellian monism is that it can be interpreted in a way that kind of fits with different philosophical traditions. Like, for example, you have physicalist Russellian monism, where both the structural part and the quiddities, they're considered like fundamentally physical. And people like Stolger and Pereboom, they've explored that interpretation. And then there's idealist Russellian monism, and that says that both the quiddities and the underlying structure, they're actually mental. And thinkers like Bolander and Adams, they support that view. And then you even have like neutral monist Russellian monism, which Nagel has talked about. And that's where the underlying reality is seen as like neither physical nor mental, but something neutral, a neutral ground where both the physical and the mental come from. And then, believe it or not, there's even some dualist interpretations, which seems a bit counterintuitive given the monism in the name, right?
Dualist Russellian monism. Wait, how does that work? If it's supposed to be about one fundamental kind of stuff, how can you have dualism, which is about two?
Well, one way to think about it is to say that the structural properties that physics describes, those are the physical realm. And the quiddities, those are certain fundamental mental properties. So you still have like two different kinds of entities, but they're integrated within this Russellian framework where the quiddities are what ground the physical structure. And Chalmers, he lays out these specific conditions for what makes something Russellian physicalism to distinguish it from those more traditional types of physicalism. And he emphasizes that those proto-phenomenal properties, they're distinct from the purely structural ones, and there's this a priori connection between those proto-phenomenal truths and also those structural truths and the phenomenal truths, the truths about experience.
So it sounds like, Russellian monism isn't just this one rigid theory, but more like this flexible toolkit, this set of ideas that philosophers can use to explore these really big questions. Now, as we're kind of acting as philosophers ourselves here, it's important to look at where these ideas came from, right? What's the historical background?
Right. So the roots of Russellian monism, they actually go back a long way. You can find them in the works of some of the big names in Western philosophy, especially from the 17th and 19th centuries. And Leibniz, he's a key figure, a really important precursor. He criticized Descartes. Descartes had this purely extensional view of matter, and Leibniz said, no, extension, that's just about spatial relations. It's a relatively intrinsic property. And he argued that it needs an absolutely intrinsic ground, something more fundamental. And he proposed this concept of primitive force, which he linked to experience, to phenomenal experience, as a candidate for these absolutely intrinsic properties. And you could think of those as like early Leibnizian quiddities. And what's interesting is that Leibniz, he thought these fundamental entities were mental. So his view actually lines up with Russellian idealism.
So Leibniz was already like grappling with this idea that what we see, the physical world, it's not the whole story. There's this deeper level and maybe even like a mental reality underneath it.
Exactly. And Kant, he also makes an important contribution. He argued that, we can only understand matter in terms of its relational aspects, like those extrinsic and relatively intrinsic properties. For Kant, the world that we experience, including matter as we perceive it, it's ultimately, it's mere appearance, and it's grounded in these things in themselves which have absolutely intrinsic properties. And that suggests a kind of structuralism about the phenomenal world, the world of appearances, combined with realism about those underlying quiddities. But Kant, he differed from Leibniz on the nature of those fundamental forces, and he thought that the nature of those absolutely intrinsic things in themselves, well, it's unknowable. We can't actually know what they are.
Kant, yeah, he was all about, the limits of knowledge, the limits of what we can know. It's interesting how that connects to those quiddities being inscrutable, like we can't really grasp them. What about other philosophers from the past? Who else contributed to this whole line of thinking?
So Schopenhauer, he's another key figure. In his book, The World as Will and Representation, he's also got this kind of structuralism about the world as representation, the world as we perceive it. But he goes further than Kant. He says that the absolutely intrinsic reality behind all those appearances, behind that representation, is the will. And that's a big step toward quidditism about consciousness, because it's directly linking the hidden nature of reality to something that we actually experience, that we feel. Although, he's talking about a more fundamental, more universal will than our individual conscious states.
Yeah. The will as the driving force of everything. That's a pretty powerful idea, and a pretty different one, too. Now, the source also mentioned Berkeley and Collins just briefly. What's their connection to Russellian monism?
Right. So some people interpret their work as having, some Russellian themes. Some people argue that Berkeley's idealism, the idea that only minds and ideas exist, well, they say that can be seen through a Russellian idealist lens. And then there's these letters between Anthony Collins and Samuel Clarke, and some analyses suggest that Collins was exploring ideas that sound a lot like Russellian panprotopsychism.
Yeah.
So the core intuitions, the basic ideas behind Russellian monism, they've actually been around for a while.
So we've got this long history of ideas all coming together, evolving. How did those earlier insights, how did they develop into, the more explicit, more contemporary theory of Russellian monism that we see today?
So the the modern version, the way we think about Russellian monism today, it's often traced back to, well, Bertrand Russell himself, specifically his book from 1927, The Analysis of Matter. A lot of scholars, they think that book lays out a structuralist account of the physical world. And some even think he suggests that percepts, which are, our immediate sensory experiences, those could be the quiddities, the things that ground the structure. And later on, in some of his other works, like Human Knowledge, its scope and limits, some people argue that he kind of more explicitly endorsed the core ideas of the theory.
So it's called Russellian monism for a good reason. He really was a big part of it.
Yep.
What about other thinkers more recently? Who else was really influential in shaping Russellian monism?
So Arthur Eddington, he was a physicist and philosopher, pretty prominent in the early 20th century. He also contributed a lot to this line of thought. He argued that, while science describes the measurable, the quantitative stuff, the pointer readings, he called them, it doesn't actually reveal the underlying nature of reality. And he suggested that this background, this underlying reality might be, spiritual or something like thought. And that really resonates with panpsychist or panpsychist interpretations of Russellian monism. And then later on, in the latter half of the 20th century, you have Grover Maxwell and Michael Lockwood. They both developed these theories that they attributed to Russell, which we now understand as forms of Russellian monism. Maxwell, he used it to defend the mind-brain identity theory against Kripke, another philosopher who had some pretty influential arguments. He was emphasizing that we only have structural knowledge of brain states. And Lockwood, he became a really strong supporter of this approach. He thought it was a really promising way to solve the mind-body problem. And then more recently, people like David Chalmers and Daniel Stoljar, they've been really important in refining and popularizing Russellian monism. Chalmers is actually the one who came up with the term. And then Galen Strawson, his work on consciousness and the limitations of traditional physicalism, that's also been really influential in making people think about these Russellian approaches.
Wow, it's a whole like tapestry of ideas, all these different threads all coming together. So now, as we're continuing to be these philosophers, trying to think through this stuff, we need to look at the arguments. Right, the arguments for and against Russellian monism.
Yeah.
What is it that makes this theory so appealing to people? Why do some people find it so convincing?
Well, the people who support Russellian monism, they often say that it gives us this unique and really promising way to navigate these really tough challenges, these challenges of the mind-body problem, and they think it manages to do that by combining the good parts of both dualism and physicalism, but without all the baggage, all the problems that come with those views.
I mean, that's a pretty bold claim, considering that dualism and physicalism are often seen as like completely opposite, right? So how does Russellian monism, how does it manage to pull off that balancing act?
So traditional physicalism, it's really good at explaining how consciousness fits into the causal web of the physical world. How our thoughts and feelings can actually cause things to happen. But it has trouble explaining the qualitative side, the subjective character of our experiences. The what it's like part. Dualism, on the other hand, it does a good job of respecting those qualitative aspects, those feelings, those experiences. But it has that famous problem of explaining how an immaterial mind, something that's not physical, how can it interact with a physical body? And Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, she famously articulated that challenge. So Russellian monism, it tries to bridge that gap. It says that both the physical structure and the basis of consciousness, those quiddities, they're grounded in the same fundamental fabric of reality. So the idea is that consciousness, or at least the building blocks of consciousness, they're not alien to the physical world. They're actually part of it at the deepest level.
So it's trying to find this middle ground, this place where consciousness isn't just something added on to a purely physical universe.
Exactly. And another key argument in favor of Russellian monism is that it has the potential to solve two different philosophical problems. You've got the problem of the metaphysical foundation of the structure of physics, the spatio-temporal structure, and then you've got the problem of where consciousness fits into all of this, into the causal order. But from a Russellian perspective, these might not actually be separate problems. Those proto-phenomenal quiddities, they could be the underlying reality that creates the physical structure in the first place. And because those same quiddities are also the basis of consciousness, well, that suggests that there's this inherent connection between the fundamental nature of reality and our experience of it.
So it's like this elegant, interconnected solution.
That's the hope. And there's more. Russellian monists, they also argue that their framework, it gives us like better answers to those famous anti-materialist arguments, like the conceivability of zombies, those physical duplicates that don't have consciousness, and the knowledge argument, the Mary's room thought
Right,
experiments.
right. Those thought experiments, they're designed to show the limitations of purely physical accounts of the mind.
Hmm.
So how does Russellian monism, how does it handle those?
Okay, so Russellian monists say that those arguments, they're mainly targeting traditional physicalism, the kind that's only focused on, structural and functional descriptions of reality. The zombie world, it seems conceivable, right? It seems like you could have a world that's physically identical but without consciousness. And that seems to show that consciousness is something more than just physical organization. And then Mary, she's stuck in this black and white room, and she knows all the physical facts, but she doesn't know what it's like to actually see color. And that suggests that there's something non-physical about experience. But Russellian physicalism, it includes quiddities, those quidistic truths, as part of the fundamental physical reality. So they can argue that those thought experiments, they don't actually undermine their view. They might say, okay, as a zombie world that's structurally identical, yeah, maybe that's conceivable. But if it also duplicates the underlying quiddities, well, then it would have to have consciousness. And then with Mary, they might say that she doesn't know what it's like to see color because she's never encountered those specific quidistic properties that are associated with color experience.
So they're taking the insights from those thought experiments and,
Right.
and kind of incorporating them into a broader physicalist framework. That's interesting. But no philosophical theory is perfect, right?
Yeah.
There's always, objections, counter arguments. So what are some of the main objections that people raise against Russellian monism?
So one of the biggest, the most persistent challenges for Russellian monism is what they call the combination problem. And this problem, it asks how do those micro proto-phenomenal properties, the ones associated with, the very basic building blocks of reality, how do they combine? How do they come together to create the unified, rich, macrophenomenal consciousness that we experience?
Right, right. So it's like trying to understand how, individual neurons firing in the brain, how they create the feeling of like joy or sadness.
Right.
That jump from the micro level to the macro level, from
Well,
those little bits of experience to our whole experience, that seems really hard to explain.
Exactly. So if our experience of, like, let's say the color blue, if that's ultimately grounded in these fundamental quiddities, well, then how do those basic elements, how do they come together to produce that specific unified phenomenal quality, that feeling of blue? It's hard to imagine how that would work. And then for panpsychism, there's this related problem. It's called the subject summing problem. If you have all these countless little entities and they each have a tiny bit of consciousness, well, then how do those individual micro consciousnesses, how do they come together to form one single coherent conscious subject, like you or me? That's a big challenge for panpsychist views.
So is there any way around this combination problem? Like what do Russellian monists say about that?
Well, some of them, they appeal to what's called the Leibnizian underrepresentation thesis. And that basically says that our conscious awareness or awareness of our own experiences, it might not accurately reflect the underlying microstructure. So what feels like a simple unified experience to us, it could actually be the result of a really complex configuration of proto-phenomenal quiddities that we don't directly perceive. They make these analogies to other things in nature where, you have these complex phenomena that come from simpler components, even if we don't fully understand the mechanisms. But a lot of critics, they're not convinced. They say that doesn't really explain how it happens, how those bits come together.
That mechanism, the process by which those fundamental proto-experiences combine into our everyday consciousness, that's still a big mystery. What about other objections? What else?